Well, we have new information thanks to a friend of the show, David Sirota, on how the fossil fuel industry is fueling the coffers of federal lawmakers. And David Sirota, of course, joins us now to discuss. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Lever. This piece is available in The Lever. You can go check it out now. The GOP's new war on divestment. David, tell us about what you're really describing in this new war on divestment.
Well, the oil companies, oil and gas companies, and coal companies are having something of a financing problem when it comes to private investment. They have faced a divestment movement that has pressured public resources, public agencies like pension funds, to stop investing, stop providing capital to the fossil fuel industry for the purposes of oil and gas and coal exploration and carbon emissions. And so the oil industry, the fossil fuel industry, has gone to legislators across the country, in state legislatures, trying to get passed bills that essentially use the public agencies, the public trough, the public pension systems to say that if you are a bank, if you are a company that is divesting from the fossil fuel industry, you will be ineligible to get investment business or other kinds of business from the state, from the pension funds, from anything that has public money in it. And so we've seen that kind of bill pass in Texas, and now it's been replicated throughout the country in other Republican-run state legislatures. They're in various stages of passing. And there's also a bill in Washington at the congressional level to basically say that financial advisors, the idea is to try to prevent financial advisors from taking into account whether investments for their clients, whether their investments are investing in fossil fuels. So it's kind of an anti-divestment push to use the government's resources to try to essentially punish companies that divest from the fossil fuel industry.
And David, Emily has talked about this on the show before, that there's this extraordinary new energy on the right to really dictate to private companies, how they ought to do business. In the past, that's kind of been a little bit more subtle in the way that they've approached it. But you had that one bill that Marco Rubio endorsed that was like, you basically trying to prevent companies from being woke. Now they're saying they really want to get into the boardroom and dictate investment allocations. And so once they start doing that, are they going to have a threshold? Like, we insist that companies must put X amount of their investment into these oil companies. And at what point do they start telling you which oil companies they have to invest in? Like, the level of the kind of corporate welfare at work here is remarkable, because it's now like a private right of action for corporate welfare. It's not just that we're going to give you all these public subsidies, but we're going to also force private companies to subsidize you too. Are there any constitutional issues here? And is this an ideological break, or is this just being bolder than they used to be about it?
Well, I'm not sure there's a constitutional question, because of course, state legislatures have the power to say what kinds of investments can be made from public agencies, public pension funds, and the like. And so, in a sense, they're using the power of the government's purse to try to get the private sector outcomes that they want. Now, what's crazy about it, obviously, is that this is a Republican Party that talks so much about the free market. And the idea of Republicans using the government's power to essentially provide a private sector bailout to the fossil fuel industry, and using essentially the force of the government to do that. I mean, that doesn't strike me as particularly free market. If banks and financial institutions want to move their money out of fossil fuels because they believe fossil fuels are not a good long-term investment, the idea of public pension systems using their resources to say no, or state legislators saying the public pensions have to invest in companies that invest in fossil fuels. I mean, that is, it's sort of something like a command economy, right? I mean, and it's a good question about where does a private right of action begin and end? Because it sure seems like this is a private right of action. And let's remember, this is because the fossil fuel industry has been admitting in federal filings that it is having trouble getting more and more resources to fund exploration. In other words, the free market is actually working. It's moving money out of the fossil fuel industry, and it's now the Republican Party combating that free market trend.
I was going to say that is called cronyism. So, David, there's also, I think, an open question as to whether you start setting a precedent that could be abused by Democrats and Republicans going forward. I mean, this is kind of like you're almost getting towards an industrial policy from the very people who are, constantly laughing about the idea of industrial policy as socialism. But it seems like this is something that could be abused also by Democrats, and Republicans might not even want to be moving in that direction, because when corporatist Democrats get into office, who knows who they want to use this kind of mechanism to reward.
I certainly think it's a dangerous precedent in the sense that especially when you consider the campaign contributions, right? And
yes.
In our story about the massive amount of oil and gas industry campaign contributions and coal contributions going to the specific legislators who were then putting forward legislation that says that the public pension systems are not allowed to do business with banks that move their money out of the fossil fuel industry. I mean, there is a very kind of perfect circle there. Campaign contributions go in, the bills come out, and the money flows to companies that invest in fossil fuels or doesn't flow to companies that don't invest in fossil fuels. That's the real crony part here. And I certainly agree with you that this is not just a potentially a Republican problem. This is a corruption problem, a transpartisan corruption problem. This precedent could be where if industries will now know, put money into the political system, and out will come policies that direct government money to specific places and pull government money out of other places, essentially based on the demands of the donors themselves.
Right.
Right. And at the state level, the way that states regulate activity that is outside of their scope is through this kind of pension hole loophole, you could call it. The federal level, it's kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, in the federal level, it's if you get federal contracts or subcontracts. And so like, okay, we can't just by rule raise the minimum wage to $15, but we can say if you get a federal contract, you have to pay at least $15 an hour. And so using this same rationale, could Joe Biden, say, look, if you get any federal contracts, you have to do X. You have to divest from the fossil fuel. And he's not going to do that right now with gas prices where they are. But do you think this would set the precedent for a Democratic administration to say, you know what, we can now dictate private company behavior if you have a federal contract? And most of these major companies do and need to have giant federal contracts.
I mean, sure. Look, Biden has promised on the campaign trail, he promised as a related issue, he promised that all federal contracts would be conditioned on companies agreeing to remain neutral in union elections. And he has not done that. I mean, he gave his administration gave a $10 billion contract to Amazon while Amazon was trying to block a union. But the point is that, sure, the president has the power to condition federal contracts on all sorts of things. So now that power has not really been used all that stringently at the federal level. We're seeing the Republicans at the state level kind of pioneer this. And look, some of us on other issues lament the fact that Joe Biden hasn't used that power, for instance, to deliver on the promise that I just mentioned. But sure, I think potentially we're entering an era where there's kind of a competition for who is willing to use that power available to them, who in government is willing to use that power available to them to do the things that they promised, or on the bad side, do the things that their donors want them to do.
David Sirota, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
We'll be back with more Rising after this.